I would like to just reintroduce Professor Elora Shehabuddin, a professor of gender and women's studies and global studies at UC Berkeley, and the author of the award-winning 2021 book, Sisters in the Mirror, A History of Muslim Women and the Global Politics of Feminism, right here. We are so honored to host her today again as a guest in our translational feminisms class taught by myself, Zeynep Korkman. And in audience today, we have undergraduate members of this class, as well as graduate students from the Department of Gender Studies here at UCLA. And I know a lot of students have prepared really significant questions about this work. And I'm myself eager to hear those and hear Elora respond to those. So I will open the floor to questions. Just a reminder, folks, that please use the raised hand function to help moderate the Q&A. And also, if at all possible, it's really nice to see your faces while you speak. So the floor is open for questions. Kornika has their hand up.
Hi, Professor. I would just like to thank you for sharing your time and your space with us today. I think as a class, we greatly appreciate it. I just wanted to comment on a part of your book where you talked about Brown Miller's book and how she published a feminist kind of book that focuses on a singular subject that is important to the West feminism. And you speak about how, regardless of the criticism from activist scholars, the book was still praised for transforming the manner of rape being discussed around the globe. And you mentioned that there were so many scholars that are Black and other activists of color who have spoken about this before. But I just had like this question, like, why is it that when a white woman speaks about it, that's when the subject makes waves? And does it really only take a white feminist to speak about feminist issues for it to be discussed globally and for it to gain traction? So I just wanted to like hear you expand on that, because I thought it was just such a real and interesting point that you brought up.
So thank you for that question, and thank you for reading. So rape had not been, so if you could think about, earlier periods of American history, rape wasn't discussed at all, right? It was always the woman's fault. If a rape case went to trial, the woman would be blamed for having dressed a certain way, etc. And that went on until quite late into the 20th century. So what was remarkable about the movement, women coming together again, which, we have in the past called the second wave, and there's a whole discussion about how we shouldn't use the wave metaphor that maybe you've discussed in class, but, the women's movement that gained so much visibility and prominence in the 60s and 70s was to was to pay attention to rape and make it an issue and stop blaming women who are survivors of rape, etc. So what Brown Miller did was, she started writing this book, and it took a while, and finally comes out in 1975. And absolutely, so if it had been hard for white women to prove, to prosecute a rapist in the courts, the rape of women of color, of Native communities, of Black women who were raped throughout the period of slavery, it was just, seen as something they had a right to, that the white men had a right to do. That got no attention at all. Whereas, a Black man who even looked at a white woman risked being lynched and tortured and murdered in all horrific ways. So there was that racist imbalance absolutely throughout this period. What is interesting about Brown Miller, and just to go back to your question, of course, we see that even more recently, right? With the Me Too movement, it's once white women start talking about it that it gains prominence, whereas when Tarana Burke first talked about it, it didn't get the same kind of attention. what is interesting about Brown Miller is that she I think I say it takes her a long time to actually get the book out. She finally does, and she devotes 8 pages to the mass wartime rapes in Bangladesh. So that's 75. It's not until the 1990s that wartime rape is recognized as a war crime. Wartime rape of women after the rapes in Rwanda, especially in Bosnia, that it becomes something that the United Nations puts on its agenda as something that you can try in the international court, etc., that you can try as a war crime. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's when she talks about rape as an issue that it becomes an issue. And we see that to this day. I think, but I'd like to think that our awareness of this problem will allow us to go beyond the situation where it's only when a white woman says something that we pay greater attention to it. But again, it also ties to the imbalances of access to publishing, access to the right venues, etc., that's characterized not only this, the centuries I've talked about, but continues to today, right? All the gatekeeping in the academy, who gets to publish and where, and who gets listened to, who has money to do research, who has the time to do research. All of this plays a big role. I hope that answers your question. I'm essentially agreeing with you and then giving you some more details.
Thank you so much. That provided so much insight. Thank you.
I see Nadia has their hand up.
Hello. I just wanted to thank you, first of all the introduction and all the beautiful speech. And to be honest, like I feel so connected with the book that I was like, I couldn't stop reading it. I was like, oh my goodness, like that's, as a Muslim born in a Middle East country, it really explains so many of different views that I personally have, and I know that there are so many other people that they have the same experience. And especially I when I read in an introduction that you said so many of your friends and relatives like label your view on justice and equality as stubborn ideas, that they are misunderstanding your view when you're living in a Western country, and then you're talking about those issues with your own view, and they call it like a stubborn ideas. And I felt so connected because when you come in different countries, especially out of Middle East, I feel like the experiences that you have with the people, with the other Muslims, and you can see that Islam is not just one shape. It could be it could be in a different shapes. It could anyone has their own view of being Muslim, like. But I feel like in a one country, sometimes like people like they think, oh, if you're doing something different, you're not Muslim anymore. And that's why I feel like I feel the same thing when I want to talk about different ideas about like being equal, or about the justice or something that is especially about Muslims. I feel like my family, my own like family that they live in still in Middle East, they look at me like, oh, you're just talking about something that is not right, because I think you have living there and you think that you're saying something. But mostly I feel like the idea that we get from living in different countries with different Muslims from different countries, it just gives like that view that it's just Islam is not in one way. And I feel like I don't know how to make them like see that the experiences that we get through all this relationship with other people, with other communities, is making that view that you cannot just like view Islam as one way doing right or wrong thing. And I was wondering if you have any point to just how we can clear that issue, with especially giving that ideas about justice when we are living in a different country of the Muslim country. I think you're mute.
Sorry. I think it's, what I said, it's just about meeting and learning from other experiences. So not just between the West and between the so-called West and the so-called Muslim world, but for Muslims to recognize, we are 1.6 billion people, right? So I think it's easy to get caught up in the idea that our way of being Muslim is the only way of being Muslim and it's the only way to operate. So I think Muslims need to encounter other kinds of Muslims within their own communities, but also Muslims from other places who consider themselves perfectly good Muslims, but do things differently. One of the issues with those authors I showed at the beginning but didn't dwell on, people like Irshad Manji and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who received a great deal of press in the early 2000s. The New York Times called them the true feminists of Islam, which is when I'm like, okay, I need to look into this more. They talked about their own personal experiences, which, were difficult and complicated. Irshad Manji is of Kenyan Indian origin, I think Kenyan, East African Indian origin, but grew up in Canada. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is from Somalia. And so they both had very difficult childhoods and youth, adolescence, etc. And then they wrote about them. So my point is, of course, they should share their personal experiences, but what they did in those books and why their books and memoirs were so dangerous is that they didn't simply present them as memoirs of their personal lives. As most of us would write, if we were to write memoirs, this is my story, right? It's supposed to be mine. But then they generalized from those to say, this is the story of Muslim women everywhere, right? So it fed into stereotypes, it fostered and, fueled the stereotypes about Muslim women always everywhere having these really difficult lives. And what they did is also ignore the work of actual feminists and reformers in all these countries. So Irshad Manji talked about, the situation in Afghanistan, but never once mentioned the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women, Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, and other organizations like that, because maybe she didn't know. I mean, it didn't make sense that she wouldn't know if she's writing about a place that there was this very active, organization to help to improve women's lives. So those books are dangerous precisely for that reason, not because I'm trying to take away from the difficult lives that these two authors had, but because they pitched them and sold and they were marketed as, here are these tell-all stories about Muslim women's lives. And yet these are two individuals and things are problematic and things have to be addressed in Muslim communities, like as in all communities. But it's when, these instances are taken to be sort of representative of the whole. So similarly, I think on an individual level, it's about meeting Muslims from elsewhere, meeting other kinds of Muslims from within your own communities, even your own culture, that will help people see that, oh, okay, so there are many different ways of being Muslim, many different ways of living our lives. And pious Muslims would say that it's not for us to judge other Muslims. In the end, that's for God to deal with, right? So why do people expend so much energy like, hey, oh, you're a bad Muslim for not doing this or for not doing that or for doing this and that, right? So I think it's just approaching everything with an open mind. That helps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks. Aiza has their hand up.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shehabuddin. I'm Aiza. I'm a student of Dr. Korkman, and I work on political Islam in South Asia more broadly. And your book was tremendously helpful in helping me think through some questions I had, and hearing you speak was also really, really useful. Something I really struggle with in your work, and I was hoping to have some guidance from you on this, is when I think about political Islam, and especially revivalist Islam in South Asia, it emerges in decolonial contexts. So when I think of like the origins of Theobandism and Ashraf Ali Thanwi, and then Maulana Maududi is a figure that features briefly in your text as well. Their works then become contextualized, with histories of Afghanistan and the Taliban's ties to Deobandism. But then I also read about Jamaat-e-Islami women who believe in these ideas and they endorse them. And so every time there is a feminist movement, they stand very firmly in opposition to that. And I find it really challenging to put them in conversation with one another and situating them both as indigenous feminist movements that are also, the feminist movement in Pakistan is co-constituted and it's in conversation with transnational feminist movements elsewhere. But then the ideas that Jamaat women uphold are also decolonial and in a really specific context. And I find it really challenging to put them in conversation with one another. And I noticed that that's something you do really well in your work. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
So as I say in the introduction, I said today I spent very little time, right, other than Mariam Jamila talking about women from that side of the spectrum. But I did do a lot of work on the Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh in my previous book and in some articles that I did on Maududi and his views on women and Jamaati women on the ground and how they responded. So I think we can recognize, that women involved in organizations like the Jamaat-e-Islami or the Tablighi Jamaat and other such Islamic faith-based organizations, political or not, the Jamaat-e-Islami is more political than the Tablighi Jamaat. I think we can recognize women's agency and mobilization there, but I think in the end, we wouldn't want to call them feminist because, right, they're not looking to change the status quo in a certain way. Leila Ahmed, in her 1992 book, Women and Gender in Islam, gave the example of Zeynep Ghazali, who is a prominent member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who, was always talking about how women should, their places is at home, they should be raising their kids, etc. But she was very active publicly, and she would put into her marriage contract, I don't remember now, it's been a while, 2 or 3 times, and she put in her contract that, as my future husband must support me in my political work. So she was this interesting character who was preaching something, but actually doing something else in her own life. So that was just an interesting example that may be helpful. So in terms of reconciling what others have worked on more than I have, I think in the case of Morocco and Bangladesh, and is how the two groups have come together, if we want to call more secular-minded feminists and Jamaat-e-Islami or other, I don't remember the name of the group in Morocco, have come together, sort of temporary alliances in order to push for legal reform of some sort. So, the approach might be different because even the Jamaat-e-Islami has argued, in Bangladesh at least, that some of the laws are actually, the state laws are not, sorry, I don't know how to turn this off without sort of going to, the state laws don't reflect the true spirit of Islam, right? So they are interested in reform for that reason, whereas the secular feminists are perhaps arguing this isn't up to the standards put forward by the UN Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So they might be criticizing state laws from different perspectives, but they're both arguing that it needs to be changed. So I think there have been those kinds of alliances where they've come together to work together on very specific issues. But generally I think it's hard to see them coming together because their views on what should be available or not, or what opportunities should be available to women might be might be quite different. But again, one is the theory where they're saying, like Leila Ahmed's Zeynep Ghazali, that, you know, the women should be in the home, they should not be engaging in work outside the home until their children are grown and gone. But they're pushing forward a particular view of the Islamist or Islamic-minded women, of a certain view of how things should be. But in their practice, they're probably doing things that that are quite attractive. And then you can think of some women who want to engage outside the home, and the only venue that's available to them is to do it through Islamic politics. Otherwise, you know, they face objections from their family. Again, Leila Ahmed wrote about this a long time ago, that many women will adopt modest dress because it's the only way that they will be able to attend university or work outside the home, right? So it's not, so obviously, of course, many women do it because they believe it's mandated for them by the Quran, and or it's a way for them to show piety. But many will do it because of the portable seclusion, as someone called it many, many years ago, and also a sense of security in some cases, right? So that there are many ways to think about this. But yeah, I think, I don't know if it's helpful, you could look at my earlier writings on the Jamaat.
Thank you. I'll definitely do that.
Thank you.
If I may, I want to jump in with a question of my own, since the kind of your really nuanced conversation has got me thinking about that. So this book, you explained, was produced as a response to this particular moment of post 9/11 and the ways in which the figure of Muslim women was emerging in context of broader global politics, and was, you know, including not just politics of like major state actors, militarism, etc., but also in terms of feminist politics. I'm wondering, in your previous book, Reshaping the Holy, I'm guessing, assuming was product of a different historical moment, where politics of gender and the figure of the Muslim women perhaps operated a little differently, and the intervention you were seeking was perhaps a little different. Could you reflect on that for us a little bit, so that we can really put this book, Sisters in the More in its context, but also kind of also plot you alongside all the people that you have been discussing in this book so well, in that kind of historical arc of like how the figure of Muslim women moves through politics, so that we can learn more about that from inside perspective of like transnational feminist academia and analysis.
I need to think about this more. So the previous book was based on my dissertation, and I did research on that in the mid-90s. So in the mid-90s, Bangladesh was, you know, had already been identified as sort of the NGO capital of the world. There were all these NGOs working there, and globally, there was a lot of money available for NGOs to target women. So gender became this huge thing. So there would be gender workshops where they hadn't found a way to translate the word gender. So everything would be in Bengali, and then you'd see gender in English, gender in English. But, you know, and then of course there have been buzzwords for a long time. So gender, governance, you know, you can think of all these buzzwords that appeared in sort of donor calls for proposals. So all these NGOs were working on gender issues. With the end of, Bangladesh had a long period of authoritarian rule throughout the, you know, from sort of 75 to 1990. And then we had the first democratic elections again in 91. And a woman, and both major parties were headed by women. So 91, one of them becomes prime minister. 96, 5 years later, and the other person becomes prime minister. And this goes on for a while with the two women alternating as prime minister and head of the opposition. So all this is happening. And then because we have democratic elections again, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the main Islamist party in Bangladesh, decides to contest elections because of their role in collaborating with the West Pakistani Army in 1971 in the War of Independence, they'd actually been banned from political participation for many, many years, but different regimes came in and out, and they were rehabilitated in some way, so they decided to run for elections. So I was interested in how, when an Islamist party runs for elections and has to play the numbers game. I was trained as a political scientist, by the way, right? but I've moved more and more into women's studies. So I was interested in how, when a political party is interested in winning votes, what does it mean for how it talks about women, and how does it reach women voters? Because you can't afford to ignore half the population, half the voter base when you're running for elections. So I ended up looking to see how both the NGOs and the more secular political parties and the Jamaat-e-Islami were trying to woo women as in the run-up to these successive elections. So it was less transnational in the sense of I wasn't looking at broader I wasn't looking, sorry. I've lost you, okay. Yeah. I wasn't looking so much as the transnational connections and the way we understand them, but of course they were there in terms of the donor funding coming in terms of decisions being made in Washington and New York about who would get the funding and to what end. And of course, the Jamaat-e-Islami had its own transnational connections in India and Pakistan and further afield. So it was really looking at how things were playing out, that story I told from the vantage point of rural poor women, impoverished women who were targeted by the secular parties, by the Jamaat-e-Islami, and by the NGOs, right? So, you know, like when a woman goes to the voting booth, and there's a great deal of attention on getting women to the vote, to the ballot box, you know, how did they make their decisions about who to support of all these different entities who were dealing with them? I also looked at the law and the different legal venues. You had state law, you had religious customary law, and then you had NGO organized village tribunals where you could go present your case, because that's usually cheaper than actually a formal court case. So, you know, things like adultery, etc., many people would take to the local village tribunal. Some were traditional and some were run by NGOs. So that's definitely the moment in which this is happening. And so that's what was of interest to me at the time. And so it was based on field work, on ethnography, you know, just being in the villages for a very long time and traveling around. This book, so I think the figure of the Muslim woman that gets challenged there, even though I didn't talk about it in that way in the book, is, you know, the poor woman, the rural woman, the woman who doesn't have formal education. So it's a very different perspective from these primarily elite women that I talk about in this book. So definitely challenging different kinds of stereotypes about poor women and Muslim women in the two books, but the focus is also very different. So even though in this book, the new book, not new, 2 years old now, I talk about Bengal and, you know, what's become Bangladesh, I'm talking about elite women who, including in the piece that for your special issue, elite women who are, you know, traveling and interacting with women from other parts of the world on a very regular basis. I hope that helps. It's a very long answer.
It does very much. Thank you so much. Yeah, like it really, I think, helps us think about, as you do in such a brilliant way in the book, to think about like those stereotypes about Muslim women as products of specific historical eras, specific scholarly debates, specific political moments, and not just kind of these timeless artifacts, right? How they get produced and different, how they get challenged with this kind of this deep labor that you have put into this book and to your previous book, and also the kind of political labors that, you know, a lot of folks from different strands of feminism put into kind of challenging also those stereotypes as they continue to circulate. And I know quite a few students had some questions about the kind of the dynamics and complications between about solidarity between Muslim women around the world, including in the West, and so-called Western quote-unquote women. So I'm hoping maybe we get to hear one of those questions or two before we have to let you free. Let's see, I know Miriam, Minami, Jillian, Jasmine, like quite a few people had those questions. I have your questions. There you go, Nikki.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm not sure if this is quite the question that Professor Korkman was referring to, but one thing that kind of kept coming up in my mind when I was reading your book was how colonial European gendered violences get recycled in the Middle East. And like I'm insinuating basically what's going on with Israel at the moment. I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are on like this insertion of a ethno-state into the middle of the Middle East, you know, the Muslim world. How these gendered violences of the past just get repeated over and over again, and especially in the context of like what we've been seeing in the last several months. That's kind of just what came to my mind.
I think this happens, thank you. I think this happens on a number of levels. So one is just generally the colonial representation of the colonized countries and societies. So they're the people who, and you know, many people have written about this. So they're the people without history. They're the people without lives and visions for the future and dreams for the future. So if you go back to the initial idea behind Zionism, right, it's a land without people for a people without land, right? So the idea that there's no one there, that it was this barren land, and then the Zionists would go over and make the desert bloom and make it their own, completely ignores the history and the lives and the communities that were there already. Others have written about how Jewish people had lived in the Middle East for centuries. Of course, we know that they were there originally, but they hadn't experienced the kind of anti-Semitism that they experienced in Europe, especially, you know, in the 19th century, and certainly by the mid-20th century with the Holocaust. So you have this bizarre situation where starting in 1917, the European colonial powers decide to deal with the Jewish question in Europe by giving them land that did not belong to them, to the Europeans, to the Jews of Europe. And so it's completely the product of an intensely colonial mentality, the way that this land is given to them, and then the way that, you know, completely ignoring the histories and lives of the people who had been living there for so long. So that's gendered in the sense that one side is seen as having no history, no power, and taking advantage of that. I think what we're seeing now is, and we've talked about this in the transnational feminist teach-in we did online. You know, Palestinian women have been targeted in a number of ways over the last 75 years. The Israeli state's obsession about the birth rate, for example, of Palestinian women, because they're concerned about the demographics and what that would mean for a Jewish-only nation or a Jewish-dominant nation. So, you know, there are ways to think about this, but others have definitely done much more work on this than I have. I hope that helps a bit, though.
Thank you so much, Elora, also directing us back to the amazing teaching you did, which was offered as an extra credit to folks in this class. So it seems like we have time for one last question. I see Jillian send us up.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your time today, by the way. I noticed in the chapters that I read personally, there was this common theme of Western feminists attempting to offer solidarity. And I kind of had the question of, considering these feminist movements and like previous discussions on the importance of this solidarity and intersectionality. What are some ways in which these feminist organizations in the West can aid these women's groups in the East without overshadowing their efforts domestically?
Thank you. Before I get to that, just quickly on the other one, on the previous question, I just remembered I do have sections, places in earlier chapters, which I know you weren't assigned, where I talk about how international women's organizations, working for suffrage, like the International Association for Women in the early 20th century, went to Palestine and saw, and how they bought into the Zionist perspective on, that you're going to have this little outpost of Europe in the middle of a place where Jews, Muslims, Christians had lived, it had coexisted basically for centuries, and to have this this outpost of Europe, which they saw, we can connect to this. They will help modernize. They will help modernize the the backward Arab world, etc. So there is this longer history of thinking about Palestine, and then obviously undermining women from the global South who spoke up and said, we need to talk about Zionism, we need to talk about what's happening here. So it's sort of related to the previous question, but also connects to the solidarity question. I think we've seen a great deal of solidarity from the global South towards, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement here. Angela Davis has talked about how Palestinian groups helped the Black Lives Matter movement take off, especially right after Ferguson, by saying, this is how we deal with tear gas, this is how we deal with police brutality, in that case, Israeli brutality over there. So there have been those connections in both directions. Specifically, I think your question is about how feminists here can help what's happening in other parts of the world. I think it's sort of, we are here to support you in whatever way you would like to use us, right? As opposed to going in and saying, you need to do this, that, like these are the issues in your society and this is how you need to deal with them, which has been around for a while and is not what's helpful. So I think it's sort of letting them know that we're here to support you in whatever way you might find us useful. And like letting the issues and the questions emerge from the women and women's groups in these, whatever society you're thinking of, whether it's Palestine or, Darfur or anywhere else, like what can we help with, right? So letting them define the agenda, I think is key, as opposed to, oh, they don't dress like us, so we need to go fix that, or they don't, whatever like us, so we need to go address that. That's not helpful, and it undermines efforts there, because if they, so like here, feminists in other parts of the world have their critics and hostile groups attacking them. So if someone goes from here and tries to and sort of interferes in a way that is not what the women want, it actually makes their job much harder, because then they get accused of being the stooges of of imperialism, or CIA agents, etc. So I think sort of stepping back and letting them know we're here if you need us, and tell us how you need us is far more effective.
Thank you so much, Professor Shehabuddin, for these comments, and thank you so much, everyone, for your really engaging questions. We cannot get enough of you, but I know we have to let you go, and we are really thankful for your presence and engagement today.
Thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you to all the students. These are great questions. I really would love to stay and keep talking, but I know everyone has we should go eat lunch. So thank you. I think there's a question in the chat, but I'll make a note of it and get back to her directly.
Yes, that's great. Thanks so much. That's very generous of you. All right, I see lots of thanks in the chat. So
Oh, thank you.
and that this was a terrific discussion for us, and we hope to keep engaging with your ideas in the rest of the quarter too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. This is really fun. I really enjoyed it.